Welcome to the deep dive.
You know that feeling when you encounter a concept that everyone uses? You hear it in economic reports, business meetings, even self-help stuff, but when you try to really pin down what it means, it gets a bit slippery.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of those fundamental terms. Feels simple, but then you look closer and whoa, there are layers.
Exactly. That's precisely why we're doing this today. We're taking just one source, a pretty comprehensive overview from Wikipedia, the online encyclopedia, and we're going to use it to unpack one of those really essential concepts, productivity.
Productivity. Yeah, it's absolutely central, isn't it, to understanding, well, everything from how wealthy a nation is to how well a single team is performing.
Right. So think of our mission today as kind of a guided tour through this one article. We're going to pull out the main definitions, figure out the different ways people measure it, dig into why it matters so much.
What actually drives it?
Yeah, and maybe find some, surprising bits along the way.
Just to be clear, our source is the Wikipedia article called Productivity. Perfect. So let's jump right in. If you boil it all down, how does this article define productivity at its most basic level?
Okay, so Wikipedia starts with the core idea. It's about the efficiency of production. And it's usually framed as a ratio.
A ratio.
Yeah, output divided by input, measured over some specific time period.
Output over input. Sounds straightforward enough, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But right away, the article makes it clear it's not just one single thing. There are lots of different definitions, different measures.
Exactly. And the key difference, as the source points out, is often about which specific outputs and inputs you decide to lump together in that ratio.
Okay. Let's unpack the different ways the article says we measure this. It starts with something called partial productivity. What's the scoop there?
So partial productivity measures, they focus on the output relative to just one specific type of input.
Just one.
Yeah. And the most common one, the one you hear about all the time, especially in economics, is labor productivity.
Labor productivity, definitely heard that one. The article mentions things like GDP per worker or maybe GDP per hour worked. Those are the classic examples, right?
Exactly. It's a really key indicator. It's the amount of output, often GDP, or sometimes gross value added compared to how much labor went in. Usually total hours worked, sometimes just headcount, though.
And Wikipedia highlights that using total hours worked is generally, better than just counting heads, isn't it? Because it deals with variations like part-time work or overtime.
Precisely. Yeah, headcount alone can hide those big differences in the actual amount of labor being put in. Although the article does note that getting really accurate hours worked data can sometimes be a challenge itself.
Fair enough. And it briefly mentions GDP per capita as sort of a rough measure for living standards, but then it immediately adds a really important, caveat.
It does. It calls GDP per capita a very rough measure here. Points out that just focusing on maximizing GDP can push production towards using more capital, maybe not efficiently.
Oh.
Yeah, the article highlights a technical point. The difference between GDP and what producers actually earn shows this bias. It's a good reminder that even those big headline numbers we see aren't always perfect stand-ins for productivity.
That's a great point. Diving into the details really shows you layers you'd miss otherwise. Okay, so partial productivity looks at one input. What happens when we broaden things out?
Right, so when you start including multiple inputs, you get into multi-factor productivity, or MFP.
Okay.
And specifically, if those inputs are labor and capital, and the output measure is value added, then that particular flavor of MFP is called total factor productivity, or TFP.
TFP. Okay, that's another term that definitely comes up a lot in discussions about economic growth.
Okay.
The article notes MFP kind of replaced TFP in later writings, but people still use them interchangeably sometimes.
They do, yeah.
And it says TFP is often seen as a measure of the contribution from things beyond just adding more people or more machines. Stuff like technical innovation or maybe better organization.
Yes, exactly. It's trying to capture that efficiency gain, that improvement in how you combine the inputs to get the output.
Now, this is where the article throws in one of those really thought-provoking points. It mentions Robert Solow defining technical change way back in '57 as basically any shift in how things are produced, even including things like better education.
Right.
But then it brings in Abramovitz from 1956.
Ah, yes. And Abramovitz famously described TFP as a measure of our ignorance.
A measure of our ignorance. Wow, why would he say that?
Well, because of how it's calculated. It's basically a residual,
Right.
a leftover.
Leftover.
Yeah, you measure your growth and output, then you subtract the growth you can explain just by adding more labor and more capital. Whatever's left is TFP.
Right.
So the idea is this leftover bit represents the impact of things like innovation, efficiency gains. But, and this is the key part the article points out, it also inevitably includes things you didn't measure properly, or maybe couldn't measure, errors in your data, variables you missed, limits in the model itself.
Okay. So while we want TFP to tell us about innovation and getting smarter, it's also kind of sweeping up everything we don't fully understand about growth.
Oh, there.
That certainly makes it clearer why the article says the exact link between TFP and what really drives productivity can sometimes be a bit fuzzy.
It's trying to be precise, but it's limited by what we can actually see and count.
It really forces us to acknowledge the limits of our economic models, doesn't it?
It really does.
Okay, so we've got partial, like labor productivity. We've got multi-factor, like TFP. And the article also mentions total productivity.
Right. Total productivity is kind of the broadest one. It aims to compare all the outputs to all the inputs. The article mentions a guy named Davis in relation to this. Yeah, he looked not just at measuring it, but at how the gains from total productivity actually get distributed.
Distribute. You mean like who actually benefits when a company or an economy gets more productive overall?
Exactly that. Wikipedia explains that Davis saw the price system as a key way this happens. And the benefits, they don't just stay with the business.
Right.
No, they can flow out to customers through lower prices, maybe to employees through better wages or working conditions, even to suppliers, and to governments too, through more tax revenue that can fund public services.
That's a really crucial point.
Yeah.
Productivity isn't just about making more stuff. It's about creating value that can then be shared out through all these different channels.
And the article really emphasizes this. It notes that total productivity helps explain how income gets generated in the first place, and then how it gets divided up among everyone involved, all the stakeholders.
Okay, so stepping back a bit.
Yeah.
Why does all this matter so much? What are the big picture benefits the article really highlights?
Well, Wikipedia is pretty clear here. Productivity growth is absolutely fundamental for raising living standards. Yeah. More value created per unit of input means there's more income available for everyone. That can potentially lead to better wages, better housing, education, healthcare, more leisure time, even funding for, social and environmental goals.
So it's the engine that lets us have more without necessarily just working proportionally harder or using up way more resources. And what about for individual businesses?
Well, for a single firm, productivity growth is really key to survival and success. It's what allows them to meet all their obligations, paying workers, shareholders, taxes, dealing with regulations, and still stay competitive, or maybe even improve their position in the market.
Right.
Just throwing more inputs at the problem without improving efficiency. That won't increase income per unit of input.
Right.
And that's what drives sustainable growth and allows for those gains to be shared.
It really is the core mechanic behind economic progress, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, okay, what does the article say actually drives this productivity growth? What makes it happen?
It points to sort of the immediate things, like the technology or know-how that's available and how resources are organized. Historically, it was often about adopting better processes. Think about, the assembly line revolutionizing manufacturing back in the early 20th century.
Right. Wikipedia mentions the car industry dramatically cutting the labor needed per car after they brought in mass production.
Exactly.
But it also notes that those gains slowed down once, everyone was doing it. It seems like the diffusion is key.
Yes, absolutely. How fast the new method or technology spreads, the article actually identifies 5 core drivers, things often cited by groups like the UK's Office for National Statistics.
5 drivers. Okay, what are they?
Investment, innovation, skills, enterprise, and competition.
Okay, let's quickly run through those. Investment, that's physical stuff, machines, buildings.
Yep. More tools generally make workers more capable. Then innovation, that's new ideas. Could be new tech, new products, or just better ways of organizing work.
And the article stresses how quickly those new ideas spread matters a lot.
Hugely. Then skills the quality, the capability of the workforce. Educated, skilled workers can use new tech better, adapt faster.
Makes sense. Enterprise. What's that exactly?
That's about the ability to actually seize new business opportunities. It comes from both new startups shaking things up and existing firms adapting. New businesses often bring in those disruptive ideas.
Got it. And finally, competition.
Right. Competition pushes firms to be more efficient, more innovative, just to stay in the game. It also helps make sure resources flow towards the most productive companies.
And the article adds that R&D research and development, both private and public, also fuels this whole process, expands the knowledge pool.
Builds the foundation for future innovation.
So that covers the big picture, national and firm level drivers. But the article also kind of dips into productivity at the individual and team level too, right? What does it highlight there?
Yeah, it does. It acknowledges the huge impact technology has had on personal productivity, especially for, knowledge workers, computers, software, the internet, things that let one person do what might have taken whole teams or much longer periods before.
That feels pretty intuitive, doesn't it? What else does it mention that impacts us more, like day to day?
Well, it brings in environmental factors, things like getting enough sleep, having leisure time, and crucially, the quality of supervision and job satisfaction.
The boss factor.
Yeah. A good manager who actually understands the work and can, motivate their team can really boost output. And that can create a sort of positive feedback loop with job satisfaction.
The article mentions specific management methods, like management by objectives, and even behavioral stuff like reinforcement or gamification, ways organizations try to boost individual productivity.
And yes, monetary rewards are mentioned as a potential motivator too, but only if they're implemented well.
But it's not all positive influences pushing us forward. The article actually has a section on factors that hurt productivity.
Oh yeah, this is a really important counterpoint. It highlights negative things in the workplace, like bullying, incivility, just general toxicity.
That sounds draining.
Exactly. The article explains that people who are targets of bullying or just working in an uncivil place, they end up spending energy and time just protecting themselves rather than focusing on the actual work.
And a toxic culture generally, full of conflict and negativity.
Yeah.
It just saps energy and attention away from the real goals.
The article makes a pretty strong statement here. It notes that when toxic employees leave, you can often see a measurable improvement in the culture and the productivity of the people left behind.
Wow.
It's a stark reminder of that human element, isn't it?
Definitely. It also touches on organizational structure, suggesting that moving away from strict hierarchies towards more team-based, empowered setups, sometimes called liberated companies, or using systems like Kaizen can actually improve things.
Right, because it puts the power to spot and fix inefficiencies closer to the people actually doing the work.
And for overall business productivity, beyond just individual effort, the article points to, like, management and engineering concerns, formal continuous improvement programs, production assurance, that kind of thing.
Yeah, companies are always tweaking processes, trying to cut waste, minimize downtime, optimize how they use everything, labor, materials, energy. But while small changes help, the article does say again that the really big leaps often need significant investment in new tech.
And it connects this modern productivity science back to the historical roots, scientific management studies.
It also offers a really crucial distinction. An individual employee could be working incredibly hard, maximum effort, right?
Yeah.
But if they're working on tasks that are actually redundant or unnecessary or maybe even actively harmful to the business's goals, their productivity from the organization's point of view could be zero or even negative.
Oof, that is such a key point. Activity doesn't equal productivity. Busyness isn't necessarily useful output. And for typical office environments, the article specifically calls out meetings as a major factor, potentially good if they're well run.
But a massive drain if they're unplanned, drag on too long, or just don't achieve anything.
Yeah, we've all been in those.
The article suggests focusing on better planning and procedures for meetings is often more effective than just, throwing some new software at the problem.
Okay, let's zoom back out again to the bigger economic picture. The article brings up something known as the productivity paradox. What's that about?
Yes, the paradox.
Yeah.
This refers to the observation that during certain periods, even though there were significant technological advancements happening, overall productivity growth seemed to slow down.
Slow down.
But hang on.
Yeah, the article specifically mentions the period from the 1970s into the early 90s, and then points to it happening again from the 2000s through the 2020s.
That feels really counterintuitive. We got personal computers, the internet, smartphones. Shouldn't productivity just be constantly accelerating? That's exactly the paradox, and the article is clear. There's no single agreed-upon explanation for why these slowdowns happen.
Really? It's still debated.
Oh yeah, big debate. Are the easy productivity gains just harder to find now? Are we maybe just measuring things wrong, especially in the digital age? Or does it just take a really, really long time for the full benefits of these huge transformative technologies to actually show up in the big aggregate
And that
statistics?
brings us right back to TFP being called a measure of our ignorance, doesn't it?
It really does.
If our tools for measuring productivity across the whole economy are imperfect, or maybe they miss key things, then perhaps the slowdowns are partly just a reflection of our inability to fully capture the whole picture.
It absolutely suggests that the forces driving productivity at that large scale are incredibly complex, not fully understood, not easily pinned down by numbers alone.
Finally, the article discusses national productivity itself.
Right, so here you're just applying that same core idea output per input, but at the scale of a whole country or maybe a whole industry, typically using data compiled within those big national accounts frameworks.
And the article highlights that national productivity growth comes from this really complex mix of all those factors we talked about.
Yeah, technological change, organizational shifts, industries growing or shrinking, resources moving to more efficient uses, economies of scale.
Plus, over the long haul, sustained investment in R&D and in people through education, human capital. Those are critical drivers too.
Definitely.
And the article circles right back to why it matters so profoundly at the national level. It's essential for lifting living standards, reducing poverty, and just enabling a country to invest in public goods. Education, healthcare, environmental protection, all that.
And even small differences in the annual growth rate of productivity, like compound interest, can lead to huge differences in prosperity over decades. It really adds up.
The article notes that comparing national productivity levels across different countries is standard practice. You see organizations like the OECD publishing regular reports.
Yeah, those are seen as fundamental data points for assessing how a country's economy is doing overall.
It's kind of a benchmark for national competitiveness and ultimately well-being.
Mm-hmm.
So there we have it. We've taken this single, pretty dense source and really tried to dig into the core concepts around productivity.
Yeah, we started with that basic definition, output per unit of input, and then we explored the different ways it's measured. Partial measures like labor productivity.
All right, the most common one.
Multi-factor approaches like TFP, that total factor productivity.
Measure of our ignorance one.
Yeah. And that comprehensive view of total productivity.
And we clarified why productivity growth is just so vital for improving living standards for everyone, for ensuring businesses can actually compete and thrive, understanding that the gains get shared out in different ways.
We looked at those key drivers the article laid out: investment, innovation, skills, enterprise, and competition, plus, the underlying role of R&D.
And we even dove into the human and organizational side, talking about what influences individual and team productivity,
Yeah.
including those surprisingly big negative impacts of workplace toxicity.
Yeah, and the influence of meetings, good or bad.
Right. And we touched on that crucial difference between just being busy and actually contributing to the organization's goals. True productivity.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we wrestled a bit with that intriguing productivity paradox, those puzzling times of slow growth, even with new tech, connecting it back to TFP and the idea that maybe our measurement tools themselves have some limitations.
Yeah, it really underscores that while we can measure aspects of productivity, the full picture is incredibly complex, maybe more than we realize.
So what does this deep dive into just one source mean for you listening? Well, perhaps it gives you a slightly different lens, a way to look at your own work, maybe your efficiency, the dynamics in your team, or even when you see those national economic headlines. It's about trying to see the underlying engine, the value creation happening underneath.
Understanding all these different facets definitely gives you a more nuanced view than just that simple output over input ratio we started with.
Definitely. So let's leave you with this final thought, and this comes directly from the source material we've been discussing. Given that even the experts in the field admit there are parts of productivity growth they can't fully explain, referring to total factor productivity as that measure of our ignorance, what does this tell us about the complex, maybe even unseen forces that truly drive progress and prosperity in our world? Something to think about.